Great, here we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the last talk of the School of Teacher Education Colloquium series. Today's presenter is Dr. Lama. The title of her talk is Epistemic Empathy as a Target for Teacher Learning. Dr. Lama is an associate professor of science education in the School of Teacher Education and a core faculty in the FSU Teach program. Before earning her doctorate in science education at Tufts University in 2014, Dr. Jaber started her career as a middle and high school science teacher. Dr. Jaber's research examines learners' disciplinary engagement in science, in particular, learners' feelings and emotions within that engagement, both in face-to-face and online learning environments. She also studies how teachers promote learners' engagement through responsive teaching practices and examines the role of teachers' empathy in that process. Dr. Jaber's research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, including NSF, an NSF Early Career Grant, and another NSF-funded project with colleagues at FSU. And she was recently awarded the 2021 Early Career Research Award from the National Association for Research in Science Teaching. We're very happy to have Dr. Jaber today, and we look forward to hear her talk. So just a reminder of the format again of the colloquium talk. Dr. Jaber will give her talk for about 30 minutes, and we will leave the Q&A after she finishes. But please feel free to put any questions that you may have in the chat as well. It's all yours, Dr. Jaber.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibor. Can you all hear me well? Well, thank you all for joining, and happy Friday. I'm excited to be able to participate in this symposium, or the STE Colloquium this year. And I want to thank Dr. Ibor and Dr. Dennis for all the efforts in coordinating this and shepherding this effort this year and for various years so far. So thank you so much. Let me try to start by sharing my screen. All right. Are you able to see my screen? Excellent.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right. So I really hope to frame this discussion today more as, I'm going to be presenting for 30 minutes, but I'm really excited for the Q&A part of this conversation, because in part, some of these ideas that I'm going to present are ideas in formation, things that are in progress for me and the team of spectacular scholars that I have the opportunity to think with and learn from in this work. And I will not be able to possibly thank and acknowledge all the folks that have shaped my thinking about student learning and later on teacher learning in my journey. But I really am grateful for the village. It takes a village in academia to do the work that I do. And I'm very grateful for my mentors, my colleagues, my friends, my family, the teachers and students whom I have had the privilege to work with across the years and who have impacted and shaped the way I think right now about the work that we do. So before I get into what I mean by epistemic empathy, I thought it'd be important to motivate a little bit how I came to orient to this construct. So the first half of my talk is going to walk you through my journey from my earlier work as a PhD student and how I came to be later on interested and fascinated by this element of teacher learning and why I came to see epistemic empathy as a core component of what I think we should be carefully designing for and thinking about when it comes to teacher learning. And I know the term epistemic empathy is loaded. So I'm gonna take some time in the beginning of the talk to unpack what I mean by this term. And so it's gonna be a little bit heavy on the conceptual side at the beginning, but my goal is to animate this idea and this construct later on with some data to show you what that looks like in the work that I'm currently doing in my project. All right, so to get started, I would like to first introduce you to a student whom I had the opportunity to meet when I was a PhD student myself. And I just realized, you know what, I'm gonna actually stop screen share because I did not share the audio, I don't think. So I'm gonna quickly do that again. Okay. Sorry about that. All right, let's see if this one will work. Okay, sorry about that. So I met Sandra in a project that I had the opportunity to work on when I was a PhD student, as I said, and the project that I was part of was called the Responsive Teaching Project, Responsive Teaching in Science. It was co-led by Dr. David Hammer, my advisor, my former advisor, and by Dr. Fred Goldberg. And this project aimed to work with elementary and middle school teachers to promote practices of responsive teaching in the science classroom. And what we meant by that is really trying to support teachers to frame their instruction as about the questions and curiosities and the lines of reasoning that students bring to the table. And to see those as productive elements or the kind of the stuff of teaching. So build instruction around students' curiosities and develop their instruction in ways that respond to where students are coming from. And so in this project, one of the students that I had the opportunity to meet and learn from was Sandra, and she was in our classrooms in the teachers participating classrooms from grade 4 to grade 7. And I've had the opportunity to interview her when she was in grade 6 and grade 7. And so when I first came to Sandra to talk to her, and I'm providing Sandra as one example of many other students that have had the luxury to kind of meet and learn from. And again, this is all to situate how I came to think about teacher learning and the notion of empathy as embedded in that work. So when I met Sandra, I told her this is going to be a conversation about science. And just the moment I said that, she said, "Oh, I love science." And she said, "You know me, science, like when you like someone or something, it's like you and somebody else. I'm that person and science is the other person that I'm hooked into." So she describes this relationship with science as something that, as someone that she's really attached to and has developed a relationship with. So when I asked her to tell me more about what about science that intrigues her or that is meaningful for her, and I will give you some context, is that we, in this, in meeting with her throughout that discussion, we watched some clips from her classrooms. And so I invited her to reflect back on her experiences in our projects classroom to tell me what was it about science that stood out for her, that made it interesting to her. So here I'm gonna leave room or invite you to take a listen to Sandra as she describes her experiences to us. And she's going to be referencing some moments from her classroom, as I mentioned. So just to contextualize, there's some examples from the classroom that she's going to be referring to.
On a book, it says what the author thinks. It doesn't say what the kids think. Right.
Can you hear? We can hear. Okay, so in this little bit of clip, she's referring to a contrast between, other subject matters where there's reliance on heavy reliance on book, and here she's experiencing science differently, where she had a lot of space to think and provide ideas with her peers. So I'm going to go on with the clip.
But when you have a group discussion, it's what you think. And when you have a group discussion and somebody says something, you say, "Oh yeah, I want to add on that." Especially when we talked about the puddles, most kids, they stuck with the same thing, evaporation, but then everybody's mind expanded into different things of what happened to the water. In fact, when we first started, there were so many different responses flying back and forth, and just by one question, all those opinions came flying out. That's why I like science, because one question can bring out everything that you think about that. Yeah. That's what.
So in this bit of data, I hope you were able to feel the animation and the passion with which Sandra talks about science. And what stands out to me in her story is that what attracts her, what the ways in which she found joy in science is that she got to experience herself as an author or a constructor of ideas, as someone who can engage with her peers in this back and forth sense-making and exploring phenomena. And her fascination with how one idea or one question can bring up so many different ways of thinking. So this appreciation of the generative nature of thinking of questions in science. And you know, one thing that I will say is that
it can bring out everything.
Sorry. One thing that I will say here is that Sandra, at the time when I interviewed her, was about 11 years old. And we have evidence in this project that Sandra has sustained this kind of interest in science. But at the same time, I will say that unfortunately for many students in middle school, starting at the age of 10, we have research that suggests that they start to see science as something that is alienating or intimidating, that is closed off to them. And this is particularly the case for students who are from populations that have been historically underrepresented and underserved in STEM field, including girls, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, students of color, Black and brown kids, and students from diverse linguistic backgrounds, immigrants, etc., who start to notice early on that science learning spaces are not very welcoming and inviting to their own ways of thinking, of feeling, of talking, of performing. So in some ways, when we think about Sandra's story, we can see it as a hopeful story. We can see it as a story that motivates us to understand how can we design learning environments where all students, and particularly students from marginalized populations in STEM, can come to see themselves as agentive sense makers who can participate meaningfully in the discipline. And I will just note here, my point is not to say, oh, we need classrooms that make everybody become scientists. That's not the point. But at least we need classrooms that give students opportunities to come to encounter the discipline in meaningful ways and to not send them messages, explicit or tacit, about whether they are welcome or not in this discipline, in this space. So before I return to this question of design, of how can we design learning environments that are welcoming to students, ways of sense making, I want to turn to another student. And here is Maria. And so I want to also introduce you to Maria and how I came to get to know her as when she was an undergraduate student taking a course in physics. The course was actually taught by David Hammer again, and it was designed to center students' thinking and experiences in ways that really reflect responsive teaching practices or principles that I've mentioned earlier. So a lot of the ways in which David frames physics instruction is around this idea from Einstein that science, the whole of science, is nothing but a refinement of everyday thinking. So inviting students to come to see scientific ideas and conceptions as rooted in everyday experiences, reasoning, and intuition. Now, I met Maria, well, at the beginning of the course, when Maria joined this course, she felt that first, this course is changing the games for her. She wasn't feeling that she can be a sense maker in this space. And she expressed being intimidated and experiencing a lot of anxieties about whether she can successfully engage in this course. And throughout the semester, something changed for Maria. And I had the opportunity to interview her at the end of the semester where she reflected on her experiences in the course. So I want you to take a listen again to Maria and how she describes her experiences.
I've always been intimidated by physics because it's physics, you know. And physics actually...
Oops.
Actually, this semester was a big trigger for me with anxiety. As an outsider, it just looks really complex. And it was really interesting, but I didn't think I could do it. I was like, it's really interesting, but do I really have the brains for that? I'm not sure. But I reached a point with the way we were doing this class where I was more fascinated than intimidated. It started being like, if I don't know the answer, then, oh goody, we have another problem to solve. Oh, we have this big problem, you know, and it's so complex and it's scary, but it's also exciting because let's see if we can figure this out, you know, and when you do, it's so rewarding in the end because it's just I don't know, it's such a high when you figure something out. You're just so excited. And I was so fascinated that the anxiety didn't matter anymore. And that's really significant.
So I wish I can sit with you and think about this clip and what stands out to you. But what I'll do instead, and maybe if you have notes or thoughts on your mind or feelings that you're experiencing right now, please feel free to jot them down if you'd like to share in the chat. But to me, what really strikes me in Maria's story of transformation is how she entered this course feeling really intimidated by the experience of uncertainty, of not knowing, and associating those ideas with a sense of failure or a sense of insecurity about herself. She positioned herself as this outsider to physics, right? And I will say she came to decide to minor in physics after this course. So in some ways, right, she's redefined her relationship with physics. And what was so powerful in the story, I think, is to me to reflect on the power of teaching. In this course, Maria came to reframe the experience of confusion and challenge from something that is anxiety-provoking and disempowering to something that she could actually feel that she is excited about and that she longs for. She's looking for those kinds of experiences. So her story refers to the importance of both the affective, right, the emotional work that she had to do that was quite closely entangled with her thinking about what the discipline means. So her epistemological orientations and attunement to the discipline. What does it mean to do physics? And what does it mean to experience those feelings in physics and come to see them as something that is part and parcel of the discipline? And it's really easy to imagine a different outcome for Maria had she encountered a learning space that did not really allow her to bring in her vulnerabilities and her insecurities and to work with her and embrace all those ways of feeling and expectations that she had at the beginning, right? So in some ways, her story again reflects the power of teaching. And both stories to me speak to this idea of hope and how can we, in some ways, think about these stories of hope to inform our thinking about teaching and teacher education? And so I'm going to highlight really two major things for me as major takeaways from these stories. And I would say these are just examples of stories that are part of a larger data set that I've had opportunities to work with. But I would say that on one hand, right, both of the stories highlight to us the importance of coming to view feelings and emotions as part of what students experience and come to learn in science, instead of seeing them as tangential or even as separate from cognition, right? So there's been a long tradition in science in particular and other STEM fields to view affect, the feelings, the emotions, the motivations as in the way of the cognition, of the rational thinking. So here the stories invite us to really question that and to embrace thinking about, the value of emotions, including wrestling with vexation, anticipating the pleasure of a new understanding, becoming driven by feelings of puzzlement and curiosity, and coming to manage and be motivated by feelings of confusion and frustration instead of thinking of intellectual challenges as disempowering. So in some ways, it's important then to acknowledge that if we want to recognize and cultivate the beginnings of science in children and youth thinking, we need to attend and be responsive to the feelings, the wide range of feelings and emotions that they bring to the table, right? So what does it mean to tune in and respond to the feelings and emotions of students? And the second thing that also this brings to my attention is when we think about what it means to do this work, it's important to think about the nature of classroom environments that we design. How are we designing classroom environments and pedagogies that recognize, center, and elevate learners' varied ways of knowing, of being, and of feeling in science, and particularly for students from historically marginalized population? So how can we think of pedagogies that allow students to bring their whole self, right, in more humanistic ways, humanizing ways, so that they can see that all parts of themselves, including their feelings, including their ways of thinking, their everyday experiences, their linguistic resources and backgrounds are honored, are allowed to be in the spaces of science learning and more broadly learning in general, so that they can develop fulfilling and deeply meaningful relationship with the discipline and experience their learning as a joyful pursuit. Now, I will say, right, we can ask this question, but also we know that this work is hard. And despite growing attention in the field to the need to cultivate instruction that is responsive to learners' experiences, there's yet much to understand about how do we support teachers to do this important work. And why this is hard, in part because to be able to respond to and honor and elevate and center learners' emotions and ways of thinking and ways of talking, teachers need to move beyond their familiar and comfortable ways of thinking and of feeling, right? To be able to take learners' perspectives and to see how to the learners, their ideas and emotions make sense. So the teachers in some ways need to put on hold their own perhaps expectations or how they came to think about the discipline or how they came to view or feel about particular things in order to be able to channel and think about how learners are experiencing these learning environments. But in many cases, this work is difficult because in many cases, there's a discrepancy between teachers' ways of thinking and knowledge systems and frames of references and their own students' repertoires and meaning-making devices, especially in classes where, in most cases in the United States, the teaching workforce does not represent the varied funds of knowledge, the varied experiences at all levels, cultural, linguistic, racial, all diversity that exists in our current classrooms. So that makes the work of centering learners' experiences even more difficult. And this idea of hearing and responding to the nuances and the merits in student thinking become a little bit tricky. And it is this discrepancy between teachers and students' frames of reference and experiences that motivated me early on to think about this importance of what I refer to in my work as epistemic empathy. So with that, I'm going to start digging into that concept. If I'm going to be a little bit maybe heavy on the theory side. So if there are questions that come up for you, feel free to jot them down in the chat and we'll come back to them or take note of them and we'll come back to them. So as I said, this discrepancy between teachers' ways of meaning making and their own students' ways of meaning making entail that teachers learn to decenter from their own perspectives to be able to tune into and appreciate the intellectual and emotional experiences of their learners within an epistemic activity in ways that could be deeply humanizing for learners. And why am I talking about epistemic empathy? And what do I mean by epistemic activity? Broadly speaking, I'm referring to this as any activity that is centered on the production, communication, and critique of knowledge in order to make sense of a phenomenon. And I discuss teachers' empathy as epistemic to highlight a specific aspect of teacher empathy that has been overlooked, I would argue, in past research on teacher empathy, whereby a lot of discussions on teacher empathy has described it as occurring outside of or distinct from learners' epistemic experiences or their experiences in grappling with ideas to develop new understandings, right? So what I'm highlighting in this work is the importance of tuning into learners' ways of thinking and feeling as they wrestle to make sense of something, to dig into the roots of their ideas and how they came to formulate ideas and feelings and expectations around an activity, a sense-making activity. So in my current work, and this is the NSF Career Project, I'm interested in examining the role of epistemic empathy in being a driver for more expansive and equitable responsive teaching in STEM classrooms. And what I'm proposing, and I will say, as I'm using the I here, but really this work is the representation, again, of a lot of conversation with many, many generous folks and fantastic scholars who have shaped my ideas, including folks here at FSU, Dr. Sherry Sutherland, Dr. Shannon Davidson, who is working with me on this project as a postdoc. And I'm so excited to have had her through the years, and I'm excited for her next journey. She's going to be an assistant professor in science education at the University of Alabama. But I won't let her go too far. And then fabulous graduate students who I've had the opportunity to learn with and grow with, including at this point, I'm working with Alison Metcalf on this project as well. So in this work, what we're trying to understand is and empirically examine this relationship, this conceptual link between epistemic empathy and the enactment of responsive teaching practices. And we're arguing or suggesting that epistemic empathy can serve to stabilize teachers' attention to students' experiences and contributions, to help them develop asset-based and strength-based orientations to learner, so fighting against deficit perspective, especially when learners are coming in with ideas that might be idiosyncratic or not aligned with the canon or with the teacher's ways of thinking. So what do we do in these moments when ideas or emotions in our classroom from learners come to us and we at first hand, we think, what is going on? This doesn't make sense. How can epistemic empathy serve to allow us to pause and think and take the time to make a deliberate choice about how we view, interpret, and in turn respond to the students in ways that center their ideas and affirm their brilliance and humanity. I'm gonna move on to, I think I just talked about that. And I think this is, again, especially important for troubling and disrupting patterns of oppression and exclusion that have served to marginalize students of color and other historically underrepresented students in STEM learning spaces. Briefly, and after that, I'm going to move to talk about how we're working to cultivate epistemic empathy in our teacher education context and animate what that looks like in our data. But before we get there, just to give you a sense of how we're currently conceptualizing this idea, we're thinking of epistemic empathy as encompassing a cluster or constellation of elements and dimensions. And it starts with this dispositional element, which necessitates that teachers come in with an orientation to learner that entails an asset-based way of thinking about learners and what they bring to the table, really believing that youth and children in our classroom have things that are important to share with us. And our job is to really make room for them to share those. And so a genuine interest and patience to understand another person's epistemic experience. And that necessitates attention and attunement that is both affective, right? So what are the feelings that they experience? So those could be examples where a teacher expresses noticing a learner's affect or an emotion, anticipating how some students might feel in response to something. And the cognitive element, so understanding the roots of their thinking. How are they coming to construct ideas that they're putting together, even when those ideas seem at first hand that don't make sense, quote unquote, or how they're framing an activity, how they're coming to understand what we're doing in this space together. So I'm going to present some examples of what those look like. But before I do that, I will say that in the current project, we're designing educative experiences that we see as our main goal is to really cultivate the stance of empathy that entails a developing pre-service teachers' humility and curiosity around students' sense-making and helping them to see their emotions and intellectual contributions as valuable. So, so far we're seeing that a cluster of activities that are enacted in tandem are quite supportive of developing epistemic empathy. So those include reading about diverse ways of students knowing and feeling in science, engaging as science learners ourselves, but really with an eye towards surfacing our biases and assumptions about what it means to learn science, ideas, perhaps narrow conception about notions of success and who is allowed to participate, who's capable of doing science. Analyzing videos and artifacts of student thinking those are videos that are carefully curated to showcase moments of student thinking that are maybe difficult to make sense of, and that nuance the sense making in learners. So we pause videos to think about, what do we see in this moment? What do we anticipate will come up next? And we engage in these unpacking of the videos. And then lastly, providing the teachers that we work with opportunities to closely interact with learners in different settings. So I'll give some examples of what that looks like when we see the evidence of epistemic empathy in our data, the kinds of stuff that excites us. So I'll provide some examples from readings. Here's a reading from Beth Warren and Anne Roseberry, using everyday experiences to teach science. And one of the teachers that we work with noted about one student's idea, Zina's idea, really made me consider how many of her good ideas might be stifled if she were to have a teacher that underestimates her capacity to reason simply because of a language barrier. So in this reading, it provides an example of an emergent bilingual who is really communicating a very important ideas, but having some difficulty with the language and using multimodal ways to express her thinking. And here's the teacher noticing the importance of that work. Here's another example. And in this reading from Ballinger and Carpenter, it's representing also, again, students' ways of sense-making that are embodied and imagined. So a student is animating a science idea about growth by thinking about her socks shrinking because her feet are growing and describing that embodied experience. And the teacher noting that the valuable idea that Elena here is contributing, that at first hand might not look sciencey. She's not using scientific word, but still she's contributing valuable insights about and a novel way of thinking about growth. The last example from the reading is from this piece that is also coupled with a video that showcases students from actually, there are many examples in this piece, but one of the examples talks about a student who is trying to communicate a physics idea in an undergraduate course and animating this idea. He's with lots of storytelling around this notion of blueberry pie. And when you think of it, it's hard to understand first what's the meaning in the idea, but really when you sit with it, you come to realize that as this teacher is saying, the way we explain a concept might differ structurally from how another person explains it. And this is especially the case for lower socioeconomic for students from lower socioeconomic status, as linguistic barriers can get mistaken for lack of elegance, intellect, and ability to communicate. And this teacher saying, when we really listen to what students have to say, we come to see the validity in the point that they are making and their abilities to learn and engage. So here we again see the development of this capacity for listening, right? And it's important in helping teachers come to see the merits and the value in students' contributions. I'm going to provide brief examples from the rest of the activities. So as I mentioned, engaging in learning science and critically examining our own assumptions and biases. Here are some examples of a teacher noting how, right, like the joys and feelings of excitement in figuring something out was very powerful in his own experience, and wanting to really transfer and communicate that experience to their student as something that they saw as powerful too. And then the second quote here speaks to, this one, speaks to how being in the space of uncertainty and wrestling, and because in those experiences, we really engage in open-ended science questions that might make pre-service teachers feel like they don't know the answer, and that might be threatening to their identity at first hand. But we go over and discuss these feelings, and part of what this teacher is highlighting is that we came to learn kind of through empathy, because we got to experience those feelings and came to appreciate their value. The third one is the videos of student thinking. So in this video, or in these responses, they showcase again examples of pre-service teachers coming to appreciate and be fascinated by students' ideas when they can think by their, they're left to their own thinking. And then I appreciate this quote here, which says, just to see how differently every student thinks about the processes of cloud formation and precipitation is mind-blowing, right? All the students have some productive beginnings in their thinking. So again, this attunement to where students are coming from and seeing the assets in their thinking. This is the last one, which relates to opportunities to interact with students. And part of what I saw in those experiences for teachers is they came to see that other students who may have experiences very different from their own can also make sense in ways that are meaningful to them. So here's a teacher talking about the noticing glimpse of joys from somebody experiencing a sense of intuition about an idea and an understanding that shaped up for them. And again, this idea of noticing how students can be extremely smart, including at times where we come in with assumptions that might be different. So we have lots of data that talks to teachers revisiting some of their assumptions about students. So as I As I will also come back, as I said at the beginning, I'm not presenting a particular study, but I'd be happy to talk about some analysis and findings that we're seeing to elaborate and empirically examine this conceptual link between epistemic empathy and expansive and equitable responsive teaching. But I would like to kind of end with some things that we're wrestling with before I open it up to conversation with the groups. So I think I've already said a lot of that, so I'm gonna skip this one. Here are some couple of publications that I'd be happy to share where we're examining this relationship and provide more with one with pre-service and one with in-service teachers. And we have some developing analyses that we are working on, hopefully to get it out soon. But the things that we're wrestling with when we talk about epistemic empathy or empathy in general, it's really hard. I would say that, first of all, when we think about epistemic empathy as stabilizing teachers' attention to students' thinking and experiences and feelings, we need to acknowledge that teachers' attention and responsiveness is also competing, right? There are many, many factors and constraints competing for teachers' attention, including curricular, institutional, and other external pressures that teachers need to grapple with. So it's important to recognize this as we work with teachers around this notion of epistemic empathy. And then more importantly, it's important to think about issues of power and issues of status when we think about empathy, right? So who is doing the work of empathizing? Who is being asked to empathize? And who's being empathized with? So whose ideas and ways of thinking are being acknowledged and elevated, especially when we know that as human beings, we tend to empathize with people who speak like us, who feel like us, maybe who experience the world in ways that are similar to us. So how do we disrupt that, or how do we work intentionally to problematize that in ways where empathy does not become, again, a channel to reproduce patterns that have existed, that have really done harm to many of our students. And then this is where, again, it's important to think about the risk of implicating one's ways of thinking and feeling onto another, right? So how do we keep that in check? And to recognize that epistemic empathy is not radical acceptance. And there are times where we need to move beyond empathizing towards disrupting certain harmful narratives and perspectives. But then the question is, who gets to decide when are the right times? So these are questions we'd love to have conversations around with you all. And moving forward, right, as we continue to wrestle with these questions, we're also continuing to think about refining the educative experiences to cultivate empathy. As I mentioned, thinking really carefully about the pitfalls, especially with regards to issues of equity when it comes to empathy. And then thinking about how epistemic empathy, we were hoping to do that in the project, but due to COVID and other constraints, it became more difficult to do. But how might epistemic empathy nurture students' own empathy for one another's experiences and perspectives in ways that would foster more inclusive and compassionate science classrooms? And I would say probably more broadly, more empathetic and inclusive and compassionate societies. I'll be happy to share some select references that shape this work. But more importantly, I'm excited to have a conversation with you all. And feel free to email me if there are things we don't get to discuss during this conversation.
Somebody has their hand. Oh, Veronica, go ahead. I see your hands up.
Yeah, I'll start the conversation. Thank you, Lama, for your talk. I find it so fascinating to hear people's approaches in other disciplines and trying to see to what extent this would be applicable to the population that we work with. And so, as I'm listening to you talk about the theory as well as, the how teachers are encouraged to observe and take into consideration what the students can bring to the table. It sounds like a lot of the strategies that teachers are using relies on the students' ability to communicate their thinking, right? And so you mentioned like lots of open-ended questions and so forth. So, I started to think about, our kids with special needs, particularly those who are included for the most part, in general education classrooms. We would hope that all of our kids are, but I'm thinking, particularly those who, are primarily in taking science classes, right? But for whom, because of their disability, may find oral communication difficult, right? Or that might not be a strength of theirs. So, I mean, does the theory allow, or do you know of any work in terms of how teachers might kind of still include and better kind of understand the voices of kids for whom are not able to really articulate their thinking, right? Are there other strategies other than relying primarily on oral and verbal communication that would allow our students to be better contributors to the conversation?
Veronica, hello. Thank you so much for the question and for pushing me in this direction. Again, it's somehow, right, we focus on whenever we focus on something, we overlook certain things, right? This is the part of the biases we have. And I will say in this work, we haven't sat really carefully with this notion of, like, when we think about the population of students, who are we thinking about? Who are we privileging, and who are we thinking that we're serving most, in most cases, in terms of like the students, as you were mentioning, students who might have certain challenges in expressing and communicating, including students who might have not only their ideas, but also their emotions, right? To the extent that we went there in this work, I would say is that we've been really pressing teachers that we get to work with to consider multiple modalities of thinking about what it means to communicate and perform science. So it's not just, don't just focus on, right, privileging written forms of, written forms or even discursive form, as in like a talk-based form, but also like expressing ideas in ways that could be more imagined, embodied, and story-like. But I have not really, as myself as a scholar, really delved into literature that would allow me to better even empathize with experiences of learners who I think having conversation with you all who are expert in that area would be super important. And that's something that I haven't yet sat with much. So I'd like to throw the question back at you, and not necessarily now to put you on the spot, but if you have ideas of, what would be encouraging for students, for the kind of population that you get to work with on a day-to-day basis in our science classroom, is in the inclusive spaces of science learning, how can we make their own experiences included and honored and elevated more? I would love to know more about that. So I know I'm not answering the question. I'm saying the question is making me think, and it's inviting me to do more work with that specific population, perhaps.
Yeah, and I didn't expect you to have like a definitive answer. But yeah, I think that it's a really interesting thing to think about and to continue to work towards, especially around, I think in special education, we oftentimes have this discussion around working against kind of that deficit model, which, especially with kids with disabilities, oftentimes it is very much teachers' views of them can be very much oriented to what they can't do as opposed to what they can bring to the table. And so that's within people who are trained in special ed, right? So I'm thinking that might be even more problematic in the general education setting, with general teachers not really knowing this is a kid who really does belong full-time in this classroom, right? And well, all kids belong in the classroom, but this is a kid for whom this is the most appropriate environment, and how can we really encourage them to be able to participate and be part of that community, and be included in the community and the discussion.
Feel more legitimized, and feel that their own experiences and ways of feeling and experiencing and being are also honored, and there's room for them too.
Right.
Sherry, you want to jump in?
I was just in an elementary classroom where one of our wonderful elementary pre-service teachers was working with a group of first graders around sinking and floating, which is actually a very difficult concept to understand. But they went through the material, and what she did at the end was have them build something that would sink and float. They use these, I'm doing this with my hand, like they use these devices. They've had them ever since, the beginning of the year, and they routinely use them to build something. And they had to build something that they would predict would sink or float. And then they all walked up one by one to go test it out, and then to try to figure out why they might be right or wrong. But I think that's just a lovely sort of kinesthetic example of kids putting these ideas into or bringing them to use for construction. So I think as much as I've denigrated the engineering practices that they've now sort of pushed into the science community, it does allow for a way for kids to express what they know through something other than just writing or drawing.
It sounds to me that this comment also resonates with your, Lindsay, with your, oh, not Lindsay, sorry.
Denise, yes.
Denise, sorry.
Yes.
It seems that your comment is also getting at something similar to Dr. Sutherland's point, maybe. I'd love to hear pushbacks. Like, what was there something in whatever I shared that feels, I don't know, did not resonate with you all, or as human beings or as scholars? Like, what are some things? What are some areas? What are some pitfalls? Things that I might be, me and my group might be overlooking. I mean, that's one thing I'm selfishly interested in. But I'd love to answer, to engage in any conversation, anything that's on your mind, really.
Dr. Geber, would you be able to share those slides again? Maybe that would help us like look at those that you're wrestling with. And
is that working? Oh, perfect.
Lama, I'm going to jump in to the first bullet because this realization just makes or forces us to recognize how complicated the work of teaching is. And it's not saying that it's making teaching more complicated, because teaching is, but it's making us realize it. How many things can we keep in the front of our minds at any one point in time? And so is there a window, if we think about pre-service teacher education, where it makes sense to gradually like increase responsiveness, or do we start there? It does make the work really multidimensional.
Yes, I agree. I will say that one of the things that excites me about this notion of empathy is I think that in work around responsive teaching, what does it mean to foster responsive teaching practices? We focused a lot on like, what to say, like particular moves, like talk moves or particular actions, or and those are important. But I think that sometimes it becomes harder to kind of bring those up as like in your toolkit if you are not grounded in that attunement and disposition that you're bringing, which is a stance that has really stabilized in you, that an understanding and an awareness that the students or children and youth that you're working with are coming from places that are valuable and important. Their experiences, whether they resonate with you or not, are true to them, right? And can be also productive for their sense making in the STEM learning spaces that we're offering. So I think that can allow us to stabilize instead of focusing just on the moves, like discourse moves or other things that we're thinking about. How do we cultivate that and make it like unshakable, like a kind of this asset strength-based assumption that becomes our premise that grounds everything else. It still will be in competition, right? And moment to moment. And I will say, Shannon and Alison, I see you all. I see you both in the audience. So you might have things on your mind that you want to also contribute to this discussion, or add things that I may have overlooked. But I will say that in our work, we see that those tensions exist for teachers, including, for example, feeling the tension. Asley's presentation yesterday, for those of you who were there, speaks exactly to that, right? Some competing things of, am I doing disservice to my students if I do not guide them towards the correct answer, if I let them linger in uncertainty? When is it harmful? What are their thresholds? I mean, so out of good place also that some things can be competing and can disrupt that centering learners' experiences in moments of instruction. I'm reading your comment, Emily.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, me too.
I think you're asking, how can we be more responsive to students with language differences? Yes. We're able to communicate in English at an age-appropriate level due to different cultural norms. Yes, that's great. Yes, because I think partly what we're, there are students in our classrooms who come in with different senses and expectations about what's the right way to conduct themselves and to orient, including, like, I hear a lot about, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Eye contact, or even this idea of being animated in the way you present an argument versus being more reserved. So there are variabilities, and in terms of the cultural and emotional norms, or what some people have talked about, the emotional rules that people may be tuning to, that are very different across cultures. So what does it mean for a teacher to kind of be tuning to that as they're setting up their own norms in the classroom? And, this is the challenge of, like, a teacher wanting this is one other challenge, right? Like a teacher wanting to foster particular norms, but sometimes the norms that the teacher is trying to foster act against other people's values and ways of being. So then how do we make still room and honor how students, the preferences that students might bring to the table, but also send messages about expectations, or normalizing that it's okay if we're arguing around ideas, but we're not here, here to hurt people. So navigating those tensions become part, I think, of the stuff of teaching as well, right? Like, yeah. I appreciate the question, Emily. Yes, I'm reading also, Denise, your point about this. I think in some ways your comment makes me think of this notion of radical acceptance versus disruption. And sometimes you hear, you might have students conveying or tacitly communicating some sexist messages or some, racist messages in our STEM classroom about how they're positioning other students, or assumptions about particular populations of students. So, so I don't think it's in those moments, right? Like, what does it mean to say, I'm going to empathize with that perspective and make room and space for it, versus, there are times where a teacher will need to do the work of disrupting. And that's why I say, like, empathy is not radical acceptance. Thank you for all these questions.
I had a question, Dr. Jeber,
Sure.
and this is selfishly from my side because my interest is in identity. And have you actually thought of how epistemic empathy comes up in relation and connects to identities? When you think about your population, your pre-service elementary teachers or your in-service teachers, and also how, as I hear you from this talk, the idea of epistemic empathy as a as a skill almost, right? Like it's helping them develop this skill. It's a process over time, right? And it's interesting to see the different the iterative process that your population has gone through and what you're learning from it as well, right?
Yeah. So I will say I have not looked at identity as a theoretical construct in relation to this work, but it is so much there. And I'm becoming more cognizant about the relationship as I continue to work around this construct with teachers. And so I will say to your point, yes, in some ways, what we're doing is cultivating a capacity for listening, a capacity for patience, a capacity for putting one's own assumptions and reflect critically about one's own experiences and what shapes our orientation to somebody else's experiences in ways that surface a lot of things related to our identities and who we are. What has shaped my ways of making those assumptions? And as teacher educators, we're also this work is wrapped up with our own identities, right? So we are also finding ourselves needing to reflect and be critical or critically reflect on our own experiences and assumptions. But one thing that comes up here too is in terms of, so one is in terms of, I'll say two things about identity briefly. So in terms of their own past relationship with the discipline and whether they position themselves as scientists or not, and how what kinds of stories they have, your idea of narrated stories of oneself or storied identities of in the science, in the discipline. So I think this is becoming something that we're tuning to a lot, especially in this last round of iteration on the work, is how their past encounters and relationships with the discipline shapes their own considerations of students' learning and therefore their own capacities to attune to certain things or not to attune to certain things. And the second point about identity relates to people who have done a lot of work of bridging words, right? So people who have had encountered in prior experiences, people who look different from them, who have maybe had opportunities to work in different contexts, in different countries, are positioned perhaps or have had opportunities to refine and cultivate that stance of what does it mean to connect across somebody else's words. So in that way, they might be more inclined to do that work, and maybe they in some ways expect them to do that work more than others, which raises all questions about also who is getting asked to empathize, whose the burden of empathizing is put on, or how that also, how can we trouble for some people who have not done a lot of cross-word bridging, what does that look like? So appreciate the question.
Thank you.
Shannon, Allison, if there's anything on your mind you want to chime in, please feel free to unmute and say. Here's Shan. Oh my God, yes. Yeah, this is vexing for us too. When I think in Shannon's comment, right, when we're working with teachers who are perhaps bringing in deficit orientations and perhaps harmful orientations, the tension comes for us of how do we understand where they're coming from, but do the work of disrupting. And we know that another tension comes at this level is it's not enough to tell them, no, you're wrong, because that would be embodying what we don't want them to do, right? Like just telling somebody your assumptions and ideas and opinions about this are just wrong. Yes, you can say that, but that might not be as powerful. Like that does not in and of itself suffice in the work of disrupting. So that's something we're grappling with as well, is how do you create opportunities for them to interrogate and question their own assumptions and deficit orientations when those come up?
Lama, if I may ask one more question.
Please.
So I'm thinking about, most of the discussion in when you were presenting your theory, it's primarily centered or focused on teachers or teacher educators and their role. But I'm wondering if there in the theory, if there's any room for, or if there's a need to think about other like peer students and their role in kind of supporting and developing epistemic empathy. And I mean, especially considering like, because classrooms involve more than just teachers interacting with an individual student, right? The students, I'm assuming, are also interacting, and depending on how they react to one of their peers saying, describing what they're doing, that can influence kind of that development of an epistemic, empathetic classroom.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. And I think that this is, as I said, one element of the work that we're hoping to further examine in the future. I have not analyzed yet any of that data with an eye towards the role of peer-to-peer interaction. But I tell you, Veronica, and we all know intuitively, as being teachers, whether teachers to adults or teachers of adult, adult learners or of K-12 learners, that the ways learners position each other is so consequential for whether for whether the students experience empathy or not in those learning spaces, and whether they feel that they are positioned as sensible, agentive contributors who have worth and value, whose experiences and ways of thinking and feeling are accepted or not. And sometimes, despite all the efforts that teachers are making, that there are things, interpersonal relationship or classroom peer-to-peer pressures that can be so impactful and consequential. I'm excited to do some of that work with some round of even within our adult learning spaces of how that is taking shape. But more so, I'm excited in future projects. We were hoping to do some more collections of data from K-12 classrooms to analyze student-to-student interaction, but we were not able to do that kind of thing for this round. But yeah, forward thinking, a lot of good questions that you're inviting me to continue to think about. I appreciate it.
It's a couple minutes after 2, so try and wrap up here. Thank you very much, Dr. Jabber, for your talk, and for everyone who was able to come this afternoon. Stay tuned for announcements regarding our fall 22 and spring 23 presenters. I anticipate we'll probably stay with Zoom, but you'll be hearing more information. And I hope everyone has a great end to the semester and into the summer.
Yes.
Stay safe.
Thank you all for coming on this last one. So
yeah,
Friday. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing your work. We appreciate it.